since accreditation and voting by INEC guidelines is supposed to happen simultaneously. So for many of them, they look at incidences and feel dissatisfied. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's a valid concern, and this is a question that the Electoral Commission needs to respond to. I know that following the collation up till this morning, the question was raised around the disparity between the total number of votes cast as well as the number of accredited voters. And in some states that there are some accredited voters that are unaccounted for. And that's something the Commission needs to explain on election day, because when you have simultaneous accreditation and voting, could it be that some people got accredited and they didn't vote, or whether they got accredited and then casted their ballot, but they casted it in a wrong, and they inserted the ballot paper in a wrong box, because those votes are unaccounted for, because they are not collated and they are not even termed as rejected ballots. Well, there are several reasons that could be responsible for that, but it's the responsibility of the Electoral Commission to explain that. Nasarawa, it's a big issue for these elections, and INEC needs to go beyond what it has done to explain what transpired in Nasarawa. For us in the PVT, we've been very, very clear, and our PVT figures show that the votes share declared for the PDP was out of our margin of error, and it was lower than what they should have gotten. Based on our PVT figures for Nasarawa, which I mentioned earlier, that the PDP should have majority of votes in Nasarawa. So by virtue of what transpired and by the data we gathered from the polling units, the PDP should have won the election in Nasarawa State, to be specific. But when the results moved to the collation center, that was where cancellations were done. And let me emphasize that what the PVT uses are polling unit results. When results go to the collation center, cancellation is done at the collation center. And so using that figure, and that is why when you look at the level of cancellation, it was very, very evident to us that the cancellation was done to reduce the vote share of the PDP. All right,
Professor Ogunshanki, just briefly now, is there any area, even though you scored the police excellent, is there any area of improvement, or there's no point since it's excellent?
There's always area of improvement. There is always area of improvement. And I think, so we are not misunderstood. When you say perfect, it's not 100% perfect. It's never going to be 100% perfect. But when we look back at the history of this election, we say that the Nigerian police performed well. Is that okay with you? And let me ask again, let me just say this to those people, and categorically to express my condolence to the people who lost their loved ones. In any election, we don't judge election as a success when one soul is lost. So I will not call this election successful because we lost members of families, relatives, and our own fellow citizens. That should not happen. And unfortunately, it happened, and my condolence goes to those families, and we cannot replace those people that have lost their life. All we can do is to make sure that the mistakes that were made during the process did not repeat itself. And I think for us and the Nigerian police, we will do a better job and to continue to do a better job in the next election. But there is nothing in this what we can call perfect, in the sense that even we human beings, we are not perfect. So we cannot create any system that is perfect. But we are working on it to improve it.
Just to drop this problem, it's not about what we want or us. It's about the country and us getting it right, basically. So, but we appreciate your comment on Professor Olu Ogunshanki of Police Studies and Samson Itodo of Yaga Africa. Gentlemen, thank you for coming on today. Well, Doctor, what do you think of this whole thing?
Okay. The fact that we had the lowest turnout of voters in 20 years means that the people don't have trust in INEC or maybe the president. This we need to work on for the next election. And to do this, things like electoral offenses must be prosecuted. In 2011, I believe we had 870,000 offenses, out of which only 200 were prosecuted. Nobody's going to trust such a system. In 2015, we didn't have a list. We were just told it's been collated, and we never had a list. So going forward, people need to be able to trust these institutions. The president needs to win back, the trust people had in him when he came in 2015. He needs to work with all sectors. For instance, if he wants to work with those in agric, he needs to work with the real farmers, not just those who are speaking grammar about agric accounts, but those who are really on ground investing in farming. Otherwise, we're going to have a food crisis. There are a lot of areas that we need to work on. As we walk towards the next election, INEC needs to fix all the things that must be fixed for us to have a better election than we just had.
All right.
And there must be consequences. There must be consequences for all offenders. Dr.
Molela Omotesho is the chair, Solidarity Action Network. Thank you also for coming on to the verdict.
Thank you for having me.
Well, quite a number of people have seen some of these results. All of them, as a matter of fact, the winner has been declared. But let me just walk over. Jude is here. He's going to take us through what do this mean in terms of the map. Let's look at this, because I've seen some maps making the rounds now in terms of what happened in 2015, now in 2019. How did they all shape up? Jude, take us through this scenario now. How are they represented?
Chamberlain, before we go into the map, what we've seen is that if you were on the ballot, Chamberlain, and I were your advisor, you probably would have won. Because going into this, going into this election, the opposition parties had too much information on Muhammadu Buhari not to have defeated him. Here's what I mean. Going into this election, President Buhari had lost 3 out of 4 elections. So there was a lot of information on how to defeat Buhari. Obasanjo did it in 2003. Yar'Adua did it in 2007. Even Jonathan did it in 2011. Now, I would have shared that advice with you to win. And how did these candidates do it? 2003, 2007, 2011. The secret recipe to defeat Buhari is to ensure you win in the North Central, you win the Southwest, and you get the big numbers from the South-South and the Southeast. That's how OBJ did it in 2003. Muhammadu Buhari always wins the Northwest and the Northeast. So the only recipe which OBJ used was the 4-zone recipe. Defeat him in the North Central, win in the Southwest, and get big numbers. South-South, Southeast. Same recipe President Jonathan did in 2011. Buhari won the Northwest, not the Northeast. But again, Jonathan was able to win the North Central and those other 3 zones in the Southwest. That was what we were hoping the candidates of the major opposition party or any of the other parties would have done. But the evidence now shows they did not adopt that strategy. So if you look at this map, he won 19 states and the opposition won 17 states. But here's the fact. Out of the 15.1 million votes he gathered nationwide, 77% again of those votes came from the northern region. So clearly we've seen the map. We've seen he won in 19 states. We've seen the states that the opposition party won. But what you find out is if we look at it per zone, now you have the Northwest. 7 states in the Northwest, Chamberlain. President Buhari won all those 7 states in the Northwest. He won Kano, Katsina, Kebbi, Jigawa, Sokoto, Zamfara. He won everything. Now look at the North Central, where we were hoping that, or where people were hoping that if there was going to be any upset, it will come from the North Central. Again, in the North Central, we see what happened. He won every state in the North Central, excluding Benue and Plateau states. So again, he had a huge margin in the North Central.
But it also turned out that it didn't matter if the Northeast had a candidate. But he still went ahead and pulled his victory.
Again, look at what happened in the Northeast. Borno, Bauchi, Gombe, Yobe. Those are the 4 states he won. Chamberlain, in all of his history, in contesting elections, he always wins these states. Borno, Bauchi, Gombe, and Yobe. So this time around, he won those traditional 4 states that he has always won, but he lost 2 states. Adamawa, because that was the state of Atiku, and Taraba State. He has never won an election in Taraba State. So we see a lot of consistency in his winning patterns, and the opposition clearly didn't make use of data and research in planning how they operated.
It turned out he also made an inroad, getting Kwara.
Kwara, last election, he won Kwara. Again, we had all, and the opposition had all the evidence and all the information at their hands if they wanted to defeat Buhari. But clearly, Buhari also knew that if they were going to attempt to use all the public information available, he was going to create a new entrance. So clearly, if you look at the Southwest.
What was it? What do you think the plan of the opposition was in Southwest? Yes, they got Oyo, but what about Lagos? Did they look to actually get a hit there, and did they succeed?
You talk about plan. It doesn't seem clear that the opposition had a road to victory. It seemed they were relying more on voter turnout in the South-South and the Southeast. And indeed, yes, the opposition party, the main opposition party, won all the states in the South-South. They won all the states in the Southeast. But two things happened. Their margins were poorer and voter turnout was weaker. And so if you look at the South-South, the only two states that the incumbent didn't win was Ondo and Oyo State. So clearly he had prepared to run with his previous strategy of always winning some traditional 10 states, which he won. And by those traditional 10 states, which he always wins, we're looking at Kano, Katsina, Kebbi, Jigawa, Sokoto, Zamfara, 6 states from the northwest. And then we're looking at those 4 states from the northeast, Borno, Bauchi, Gombe, and Yobe. These 10 states, in all of his elections, he always wins. So he kept to that strategy, but also preparing to look at if the opposition was going to try and defeat him in those places. He then went on to also consolidate in the northwest by winning Lagos, Ogun, Osun, and Ekiti. Even though those states in the southwest didn't give him big margins, the main margins he got were from the northwest.
Well, so in this next one, in terms of the voter turnout, which you also highlighted, where was it that it was above 50%? Just some of the states that who won? Again,
we've got 36 states. This is where everybody is concerned about. Out of all 36 states, only 6 states had a voter turnout of 50%. And by voter turnout, we're talking about looking at the total vote cast relative to the number of PVCs that were collected in those states. So in Sokoto State, one of those states that he always wins, voter turnout was above 50%. Katsina State, where the president is from, voter turnout was above 50%. Jigawa State, another traditional state that he has always won in all of his elections, voter turnout was above 50%. Plateau State here, even though he didn't win Plateau State this time around, voter turnout in Plateau State was still above 50%. Now look at this. In all of the 17 states in the south, voter turnout was only above 50% in Osun and Ekiti State. So clearly, all other states are below 50% voter turnout, and that also clearly hurt any opposition candidate that was hoping to get huge volumes from the south.
All right, let's go to break on this one. We'll come back and find out what role did any merger have on this, and that's in a moment.
Again, remember, if I had advised you, probably would have won this election.
All right, welcome back to the verdict. Just taking a look at how the president won in terms of the figures and perhaps a little bit of stories behind the figures. Now, Julie, let's go back to this particular map now. Looking at the southwest, yes, Oyo, the PDP got that bit. But in terms of the president winning this one now and before now, but if you go a little further back, before the merger, which then gave him solidified his influence or the votes in the southwest. What kind of role did that play?
So before the merger, 2003 and 2011, 97% of candidate Buhari's votes comes from the north. This time around in 2015, for the very first time, he won all the states in the southwest, excluding Ekiti State. In this election, we've seen that he's won all the states in the southwest again, excluding Ondo and Oyo State. But again, there was a bit of deception in the southwest. A lot of politicians focused on trying to defeat Buhari in the southwest. But again, remember, the strategy to defeat candidate Buhari in all the defeats he's had is win big in the north central, win big southwest, south-south, and southeast. And that brings me to the most important map of this election, and that is how Buhari really won. Let's not focus on the votes, let's focus on the margins, Chamberlain. Look at this. 3.7 million margin over the PDP in the 7 states in the northwest. That is what happened this time around. Look at the northeast, 1.9 million margin over the PDP across those 6 states in the northeast. Look at Southwest. A lot of emphasis was on the Southwest, that the Southwest was going to really swing these votes. President Buhari had the margin of less than 300,000 votes in the Southwest. And look at what happened in the South, South, and Southeast. Even though he lost, his margin of defeat in the South, South was 1.1 million votes. And in the Southeast, his margin of defeat was 1.2 million votes. So if you look at it, his margin of defeat in the South, South, and the Southeast still doesn't compensate for his margin of victory.
So perhaps what the PDP might have tried to do was increase the margin of victory in these two areas. So if that had happened, perhaps that might have challenged this figure.
Clearly, and to increase your margin of victory, you need a higher voter turnout. Clearly, look at this. In the Northwest, President Buhari pulled a margin of over 3.7 million votes. That is more than his margin across these other three zones he won: the Northeast, the North Central, and the Southwest. And look at the South, South, and the Southeast. The PDP was only able to muster a margin over Buhari of 2.3 million votes. So clearly that was exactly what had happened in this election. And that summarizes this election for everybody. 3.7 million margin in the Northwest, 1.9 million margins in the South, in the Northeast, and over 400,000 margin in the North Central.
But could the PDP have seen this coming? Because if you look at the permanent voter card collection in, I think, Imo State in the Southeast, for instance, it was a little lower than the last time I saw. Could they have seen that coming and then change the strategy a bit?
I told you, Chamberlain, if I had advised you to become president, you will have won this election. Look at what happened in the Northwest. There are 7 states in the Northwest. The PDP and all opposition parties failed to use the right data. Out of all the 7 states in the Northwest, President Buhari, again, candidate Buhari, in previous elections, always wins 6 out of these states. Kano, Katsina, Kebbi, Jigawa, Sokoto, Zamfara. He's never lost in those 6 states. And those states were the ones that gave him these huge numbers. Look at what happened this time around in the Northeast. Borno, Bauchi, Gombe, Yobe. States is never lost. Again, he never lost in those states. All the states in the Northeast combined gave him a margin of 1.9. So clearly the strategy, again, the only way to be able to defeat Buhari, but nobody will ever have the chance to run against candidate Buhari again. But if they had looked at the data right, you'll have seen that you needed big numbers in the South, South, and Southeast. You required higher numbers and bigger voter turnout, especially in the Southwest. So Southwest, South, South, Southeast, North Central, that was the key. But again, nobody unlocked that key because Buhari made sure he kept that key in his pocket.
So we can then call this the margin of lead principle. So if you can manage this margin of lead principle with these figures, then you might also just do something. So that's the story. A little bit of backstory of how the president won.
We're hoping that the governorship elections, these candidates will then be able to make sure, both candidates, APC, PDP, the smaller candidates will be able to make use of the right data to be able to plan their victory. Instead of using violence as a strategy, let's use data as a strategy to be able to win elections.
Even though we know that in terms of how Nigerians vote from the presidential and the states, it's a lot different. So by this time, who knows? It will be very interesting to look at those data when it does come out in 2 weeks' time.
And a new history has been set. Prior to this election, Benue and Kwara State always produced the winner of the elections. The new history now shows that Kwara State is the real winner of this election. So in all our presidential elections, it now shows that whoever wins Kwara State will become the president. So our next polls will now focus on Kwara. 79, 83, 92, 99, 2003, 2007, 2011, 2015, 2019. Kwara State has been the only state to rightly predict who becomes Nigeria's president.
So there you go. Thank you very much indeed, Jide Ogunso, our data channel service data analyst.